The night was thick, almost suffocating, over the jagged cliffs of the Pacific island. A humid wind carried the scent of salt, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of blood that had been spilled days before. Somewhere in the darkness the ocean whispered against the rocks, but even its calm could not drown out the tension gripping the soldiers poised along the ridges. Japanese soldiers huddled in shallow foxholes, their faces streaked with mud and sweat, eyes glazed with a mixture of fear and determination. Each man clutched his rifle as though it were the only thing keeping his honor intact, hearts hammering against ribs trained to accept courage as obedience. They had been told that today's charge could turn the tide of the battle, that the glory of the emperor awaited those who fell forward, not backward. Yet beneath the surface, doubt lingered silent, gnawing, and yet unbearable. The Americans, dug into fortified trenches just beyond the ridge, held their breath in anticipation. They could hear the faint rustle of movement, the quiet shuffle of boots over sand and stone. From the vantage point of their defenses, the soldiers saw nothing yet feared everything. They had faced Banzai charges before, waves of screaming men willing to die for honor, but something about this night felt different, unnatural. The air itself seemed to shiver. Trees swayed though there was no wind, and the shadows of the palms stretched long and distorted across the terrain. Some of the soldiers whispered nervously about rumors' strange contraptions, untested weapons the Americans had brought to the island. Others laughed at such talk, reminding themselves that fear was the mind's trick, nothing more. Yet a chill crawled down the spine of every man, whether Japanese or American, as if the island itself was holding its breath. Among the Japanese, Sergeant Hiroshi tightened his grip on his bayonet. "We go forward at dawn," he muttered, voice low but firm. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the first threads of light began to pierce the darkness. For the emperor. For honor. Around him, men nodded in unison, some muttering prayers, others staring blankly into the night. Courage and indoctrination danced side by side with terror. An uneasy truce between bravery and survival instinct. Across the line, Private Miller peered through the scope of his rifle, squinting against the dim light. His stomach churned, a knot of anxiety and dread forming deep inside him. He had fought on this island for weeks, seen friends fall in ways that haunted his dreams, yet nothing prepared him for the sense of impending horror that now thickened the air. There was a calm before the storm, but it was a calm unlike any he had ever known. And then, almost imperceptibly, a strange glint appeared on the ridge. A faint metallic shimmer that moved with a rhythm no living thing could possess. The men froze. None could yet know what it was, only that it felt wrong, unnatural, terrifying. Something unimaginable was coming. Something that would turn courage into panic, valor into horror, and etch the memory of this day into the minds of every soldier who witnessed it. Dawn had not yet broken, but the first tremors of chaos were already stirring. In the silence, broken only by distant waves and whispered prayers, both sides waited, unaware that what was about to descend on them would shatter everything they thought they knew about war. The first rays of dawn bled across the horizon, painting the jagged cliffs with streaks of orange and red. In the dim light, the Japanese soldiers crouched, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. A low hum of collective breathing passed through the ranks, almost a chant of anticipation. Then, as if cued by some invisible conductor, the soldiers rose in unison, rifles poised, bayonets glinting, and lips trembling with a war cry that pierced the quiet morning. "Banzai!" They screamed over and over, a thunderous chorus that seemed to shake the very air. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with their collective momentum, hundreds of men surging forward as one unstoppable tide. Each soldier carried not just a rifle or a blade, but the weight of honor, the fear of shame, and the unyielding doctrine that demanded forward, no matter the cost. The chaos began almost immediately. Boots pounded against the uneven terrain. Voices yelled over the roar of the approaching charge, and the clash of metal echoed faintly as soldiers checked their weapons one last time. Some men stumbled, others hesitated, but the wave pressed forward relentlessly. The jungle around them erupted in sound, snapping branches, rustling leaves, and the occasional frightened scream of wildlife fleeing the encroaching tide of humanity. Private Sato ran alongside his comrades, teeth clenched, heart hammering in his chest. He had trained for this moment, imagined it countless times, yet nothing could prepare him for the reality. The adrenaline surged, a storm inside him, pushing him forward even as terror clawed at the edges of his mind. Every step felt like a heartbeat, every breath a battle between instinct and indoctrination, from the trenches below. The Americans waited, knuckles white on rifles and eyes scanning the charging mass. They were outnumbered, but entrenched, dug into mud and sandbags, each position carefully reinforced against the expected assault. Private Miller gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. He had faced Banzai charges before, but the scale of this one was overwhelming. Hundreds of men screamed as one, advancing with an almost fanatical rhythm that set his nerves on edge. Corporal Jenkins leaned against a battered machine gun emplacement, whispering to himself under his breath, "Steady, steady." His eyes never left the line of charging soldiers, trying to pick out any sign of hesitation or weakness. He could see their faces, pale with exertion and fear, yet burning with the certainty that they would either triumph or die trying. The dichotomy of their courage and the danger it posed made his stomach knot. And then, as the Japanese soldiers neared the top of the slope, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred. A faint glint caught Jenkins' eye, reflecting the first light of dawn. Something moved strangely among the foliage, almost too deliberate to be natural. His brow furrowed, a chill crawling up his spine. It was a prelude, a hint of the unusual defensive measure they had prepared, something that could change the tide of battle in an instant. Sato and the men pressed on, screaming, bayonets raised, and hearts pounding. Their charge was a wave, a storm of flesh and metal, advancing toward a line of enemies that waited patiently, rifles aimed and machine guns humming quietly in anticipation. The jungle seemed to close around them, each tree and shadow a potential threat. Yet nothing prepared them for the force they would encounter beyond the ridge. The closer they came, the more the tension mounted. The Americans could feel it too, the pause before the storm's real fury. Soldiers on both sides were locked in a moment of suspended terror, a heartbeat where time itself seemed to hesitate. Miller gripped his rifle tighter, thinking of the chaos that was about to unfold. The battlefield held its breath, every man acutely aware that this charge could end in triumph or annihilation. Saito glanced to his left, catching the eyes of a comrade just as he stumbled over an unseen root. The man's face twisted in panic for a split second, then determination reclaimed him, and he pushed forward again. The war cry rose higher, blending with the pounding of feet and the murmurs of the jungle itself. From below, the Americans watched, waiting, hearts in their throats, aware that something unexpected lurked in the shadows. A weapon they had readied in silence. A force that might turn the tide in seconds. As the Japanese surge pressed up the slope, the stage was set. Sweat, fear, and adrenaline mingled in the humid morning air. The first wave of men neared the top of the ridge, unaware of the mechanical, unstoppable force about to descend upon them. Trees bent slightly under an unseen pressure, sunlight glinted off something not of this world, and the battlefield shivered in anticipation. No one could have predicted the horror about to unfold. In a moment, the roar of human fury would collide with a force that seemed impossible, unnatural, and terrifying. The Banzai charge, the pride and hope of hundreds of soldiers, was racing toward a moment that would etch itself into history, not for triumph, but for the shock and devastation it would unleash. And just as the first men reached the top of the ridge, The silence before the storm shattered, leaving a battlefield suspended between courage and unimaginable terror. The morning sun had barely broken over the ridge when the first tremors hit the ground. At first, the Japanese soldiers didn't notice, their eyes fixed on the entrenched Americans below. Then came the faint metallic clatter, soft at first, almost drowned by the war cries and pounding boots, but it grew louder, faster, more insistent. Something was coming. Something unnatural. Sergeant Hiroshi's eyes widened. What is that?" he shouted over the roar of his men. Around him, confusion rippled through the ranks. The rhythm of the Banzai charge faltered, a crack in the facade of fearlessness that had carried them forward until now. Soldiers stumbled, their feet tripping over roots and rocks as the strange noise grew louder, a relentless clattering that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Then it happened. From the American lines above, a torrent of steel balls, thousands of them, rushed down the slope, bouncing, rolling, and scattering with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The hill became a river of silver, a mechanical avalanche that no human strength could resist. Each ball collided with the earth, trees, and bodies, ricocheting violently, striking anything in its path with unrelenting force. The soldiers froze, their war cries cut short as eyes widened in terror. "Run! Move!" someone shouted, but the words barely registered against the sound of the cascading metal. The balls bounced and tumbled down the slope like a living, vengeful entity, crushing rocks, snapping trees, and striking men with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Sato tried to push forward, bayonet raised, but a ball struck the ground inches from his foot, sending him sprawling. He scrambled to regain his balance, heart hammering, as another steel projectile slammed into the dirt, throwing debris and dirt into his face. Around him, comrades screamed in confusion and panic, stumbling into one another as the unstoppable force barreled toward them. The Americans watched, grim-faced, as their defensive mechanism executed perfectly. Private Miller gripped the release lever, hands shaking, as he witnessed the unfolding chaos. He had helped prepare the contraption in secret, a hillside rigged with weighted steel spheres, designed to roll freely down the slope at the exact moment of the charge. Now, watching the human wave meet it, he felt a mixture of awe and horror. The battlefield had become a machine, and they were witnessing the collision of man and engineering in its most brutal form. From the Japanese perspective, it was incomprehensible. Men yelled and stumbled, trying to avoid the rolling death, but the sheer number of spheres made evasion impossible. The sound was deafening, clattering, bouncing, crashing, mixed with screams of terror and the harsh cries of men struck down before they could even fire a single shot. Each step forward became a fight against both gravity and chaos. As the once organized Banzai charge disintegrated under the assault, Sergeant Hiroshi screamed orders, but his voice was drowned in the metallic roar. Soldiers collided, fell, and rolled helplessly down the slope, some caught between the steel balls and others in their own panic. The speed was relentless, the destruction absolute. A man trying to climb over a fallen comrade was struck from behind by another ball, sent tumbling into a tangle of limbs and dirt. The organized wave of attackers dissolved into a chaotic swarm, each man now fighting not the enemy below, but the impossible force descending upon them. Trees splintered under the weight of the rolling steel, branches snapping and whipping into the air. Dust and debris coated the battlefield, mingling with screams and the metallic ringing of impact. Soldiers tried to rally, forming small pockets of resistance, but each effort was futile. The rolling balls struck with random cruelty, some killing instantly, others leaving men injured and trapped. Unable to escape the next wave dot in the midst of the chaos, Sato stumbled again, rolling to the side as a sphere passed inches from his head. The world had become a blur of motion, sound, and terror. His comrades screamed, some praying, some crying, some fighting desperately to regain their footing. The sheer horror of a weapon so unconventional, so relentless, shattered their training and courage alike. The disciplined Banzai charge, once a symbol of honor and bravery, had become a slaughter. A storm of metal and human panic. The Americans, entrenched and relatively safe, could only watch in tense silence. Jenkins' eyes were wide, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple as he witnessed the effect of their ingenuity. They had created something monstrous in its efficiency, something that turned the battlefield into a nightmare. And yet, a heavy weight of guilt pressed on each man. These were human lives. And though necessary for survival, the devastation was beyond anything they had imagined. By the time the last of the spheres had tumbled down the slope, the Banzai charge was effectively annihilated. The hillside was littered with bodies, broken limbs, and the scattered, trembling survivors crawling in terror. The roar of war cries had been replaced by moans, sobs, and the distant, unnatural clatter of the last steel balls rolling to a stop. Hiroshi, barely conscious, lay on the slope, heart racing, vision blurred. Around him, the remnants of his men shivered and whispered, unable to comprehend the sheer force that had struck them. Some looked up toward the Americans in disbelief, some stared blindly at the rolling bodies, some simply collapsed, broken in body and spirit. The battlefield had become a monument to horror. And the Japanese soldiers now understood a terrifying truth. No amount of courage or honor could withstand what they had just faced. Private Miller exhaled shakily, lowering his rifle. The enemy was decimated, their charge obliterated, yet the silence that followed was heavy, almost mournful. The Americans had survived, but the cost, psychological, emotional, and moral, was already written into the air, mingling with the smoke, dust, and lingering metallic scent of battle. The unexpected weapon had changed everything. What had begun as a calculated defense had become a spectacle of terror, a turning point that would be remembered for its ingenuity, its brutality, and its sheer shock. The battlefield had shifted, and in that instant, both sides were forced to confront the unimaginable reality of war, where the line between survival and horror was drawn not by bravery alone, but by forces far beyond a soldier's control. The hillside had become a nightmare. Bodies sprawled across the slope, some motionless, others twisted and groaning, struggling to rise only to be struck again by the relentless rolling steel. The Banzai charge, once a disciplined wave of shouting, armed men, was no more a mangled, chaotic surge of humanity crushed beneath an unstoppable force. Screams of terror and agony filled the air, mingling with the metallic clang of spheres bouncing, ricocheting, and colliding with flesh, wood, and stone. Sergeant Hiroshi clawed at the dirt, trying to drag himself away from a cluster of rolling balls. His uniform was torn, smeared with blood and mud, sweat mixing with the grime of the battlefield. Around him, comrades cried out, some in pain, others in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Men who had trained for months, who had faced the horrors of combat without hesitation, were now paralyzed by a terror they could not rationalize. It's not possible. One soldier shouted, eyes wide, voice cracking. He tried to push forward, bayonet raised, but another steel ball slammed into the ground at his feet, sending him sprawling backward into a tangle of fallen comrades. Panic rippled like wildfire through the ranks. Discipline, courage, and honor, the pillars that had carried them to this moment, crumbled under the weight of confusion and fear. The psychological terror was as deadly as the weapon itself. Men looked around desperately, searching for answers, for a strategy, for something familiar they could cling to, but there was nothing. Their trained instincts failed them. Their senses screamed danger, but nothing in their experience could explain the assault. The hillside seemed alive, the balls rolling with an almost sentient precision, an inexorable force that defied reason. Private Sato's legs gave way, sending him tumbling into the dirt. A sphere rolled past his head, narrowly missing him by inches. He scrambled to his feet, lungs burning, eyes scanning for an escape that didn't exist. Each step was a gamble, each breath a fight against instinct and inevitability. Around him, men screamed, some frozen in disbelief, some desperately crawling, trying to drag themselves from the path of the mechanical avalanche from the trenches. The Americans observed with a mix of awe, fear, and grim determination. Private Miller could scarcely believe what he was seeing. Hundreds of men, trained and fanatical, now reduced to chaos and terror in seconds. The ingenuity of their defensive mechanism was undeniable, but so was its horrifying efficiency. The battlefield, once a theater of strategy and courage, had become a scene of raw, uncontrollable destruction. Corporal Jenkins adjusted his stance on the machine gun emplacement, scanning the hillside carefully. He had anticipated heavy losses, but the sight before him was unlike anything he had imagined. The Japanese soldiers, shouting and charging only moments ago, were now scrambling, screaming, and flailing helplessly. The sheer scale of fear etched across their faces made Jenkins' stomach twist. Victory, he realized, was never so simple as pulling a trigger. It came at the cost of witnessing human panic in its most absolute form. Hiroshi crawled toward a fallen comrade, hands shaking. The man's leg was pinned beneath a rolling sphere, and he let out a wail that cut through the morning air. Hiroshi tried to lift the metal ball, but it was too heavy, too unyielding. Around him, soldiers fought and failed to escape. Some crushed instantly, others dragged down by the momentum of those behind them. Unable to halt the wave of destruction, the chaos spread upward, outward, consuming everything in its path. Trees splintered, rocks tumbled, and the ground itself seemed to shiver under the pressure of the cascading steel. Smoke from previous bombardments mingled with dust kicked up by the rolling spheres, creating a haze that blurred vision and disoriented the survivors. Soldiers stumbled blindly into each other, weapons dropped, bayonets striking nothing but air, screams echoing off the cliffs in a horrifying symphony of fear. Some of the Americans exchanged grim glances. They had expected a bloody confrontation, but nothing had prepared them for the psychological impact. This was not just a battle. It was an apocalypse in miniature. Men who had trained for months, who had mastered the art of warfare, now faced a force that rendered skill, courage, and honor meaningless. It was survival versus inevitability, and the edge belonged to the weapon, not the soldier. Sato finally paused, lying flat against the slope, gasping for breath. His uniform was shredded, blood coating his arms, legs, and face. Around him, fewer than half of his comrades remained on their feet, and even they moved like phantoms, stunned, eyes wide with disbelief. The war cries that had carried them up the hill were gone, replaced by guttural moans, sobs, and frantic cries for help. By the time the last of the steel balls rolled to the bottom of the ridge, the hillside had been transformed. What had begun as a disciplined assault was now a graveyard of shattered morale, broken bodies, and terror-stricken survivors. Every man who had charged forward carried the weight of what they had seen, and experienced an indelible mark of fear and futility that no amount of honor could erase. From their positions, the Americans exhaled cautiously. Miller lowered his rifle, shoulders tense. Jenkins wiped sweat from his brow. They had survived, yes, but the horror of what they had unleashed settled over them like a heavy fog. Even in victory, there was a price: the faces of the terrified soldiers, the sounds of their agony, and the undeniable realization that ingenuity in war could create horrors beyond comprehension. The battlefield was silent now, save for the wind and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. The Banzai charge was gone, annihilated in seconds by a force both ingenious and terrifying. And in that silence, both sides understood the stark reality of war, that survival often came not through courage or skill, but through the unforgiving logic of ingenuity and the brutal randomness of fear. The ridge, once alive with shouting and movement, now lay still, a frozen testament to chaos and terror. And as dawn fully broke, the survivors, both American and Japanese, faced the aftermath of a battle that would haunt them forever. A stark lesson in the unpredictability and cruelty of war. The smoke had begun to thin, the haze of dust and metallic tang slowly lifting as the chaos of battle faded into an eerie quiet. The hillside, once alive with the deafening roar of a Banzai charge, now lay littered with the aftermath of destruction. Fallen soldiers, both Japanese and Americans, lay sprawled across the ground, some motionless, others groaning and twitching, as they struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The ground itself seemed scarred, churned up by rolling steel, and the desperate struggle of men caught in a torrent they could not survive. The survivors among the Japanese troops crawled, staggered, and in some cases dragged themselves over the shattered slope. Faces smeared with mud, blood, and sweat reflected a mix of terror and disbelief. Their once proud war cries had vanished, replaced by silent prayers or whispered curses, as they tried to process the sheer magnitude of the devastation. Every man who had charged forward now carried the heavy weight of failure, not just the loss of comrades, but the realization that courage alone could not shield them from the unimaginable. Sergeant Hiroshi dragged himself behind a fallen tree, panting, legs trembling. His uniform was torn, his hands slick with blood that was not entirely his own. Around him, small clusters of soldiers huddled, sharing the silent, unspoken understanding that the battle had been lost long before they had reached the ridge. Some surrendered, laying down their weapons in defeated gestures, eyes hollow and haunted. Others fled into the cover of jungle, hoping to escape the relentless tide of steel that had shattered their charge. The Americans, meanwhile, emerged from their trenches cautiously. Private Miller and Corporal Jenkins moved along the ridge, eyes scanning the devastated slope for any remaining threats. Relief mingled with shock as they took in the scale of what their improvised weapon had wrought. The hillside was a graveyard of morale and flesh, a chilling testament to both the ingenuity and the ruthlessness of war. Jenkins knelt beside a fallen soldier, checking for signs of life. He swallowed hard, fighting against the rising tide of horror and guilt. We did what we had to," he muttered to Miller, who simply nodded, jaw tight. Their relief at surviving the assault was tempered by the human cost they now faced in full clarity. The ingenious contraption had worked beyond expectations, decimating the enemy charge in seconds. Yet the emotional weight of the carnage pressed down on them like a heavy fog. Among the Japanese survivors, despair was etched into every movement. Some soldiers pressed on through the jungle, moving silently, broken and disoriented, while others collapsed, unable to continue. Sergeant Hiroshi surveyed the battlefield, his chest heaving, eyes darting over the fallen and the scattered remnants of what had been a proud charge. He could not ignore the futility, the horror of what had occurred in mere moments. This was not valor, it was annihilation, a brutal reminder that even the strongest resolve could be undone by ingenuity and circumstance. The Americans, despite their victory, could not shake the enormity of the scene. Each man had witnessed the terror in the eyes of their opponents. The way trained soldiers were reduced to panic and confusion almost instantly. Respect for the destructive power of their weapon mingled with unease. It had not just killed it, had obliterated hope, shattered courage, and left a psychological scar on anyone who had witnessed it. Miller lowered his rifle and glanced across the slope, feeling an unexpected knot of empathy tighten in his chest. "They fought like lions," he whispered. "But not even lions can outrun this." Jenkins shook his head slowly, eyes haunted. "No, and they'll remember this for the rest of their lives. If they live." A small group of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle at the edge of the battlefield, hands raised in surrender. Their uniforms were torn, faces streaked with blood and dirt, eyes hollow and haunted. The Americans approached cautiously, rifles trained but restrained. Even in victory, there was a shared understanding. These were men, not monsters, and the sheer power of survival had brought them to this moment of fragile truce. The jungle was eerily quiet now, save for the moans of the wounded and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. The aftermath of the Banzai charge stretched across the landscape like a frozen nightmare, a reminder of the unpredictability of war and the devastating consequences of innovation applied without mercy. Sergeant Hiroshi finally sank to the ground, chest heaving, staring at the ridge as the morning light fully illuminated the destruction. Every fallen comrade, every scream, every impossible collision of man and machine replayed in his mind. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the charge had been heroic, but heroism alone could not survive the unexpected. The battlefield had claimed more than bodies. It had claimed certainty, pride, and the illusion that courage could always overcome the impossible. Private Miller and Corporal Jenkins moved among the survivors, checking for any signs of life, eyes haunted by what they had seen. Relief at their own survival mingled with sorrow, the duality of victory and horror pressing down on them. They had triumphed, yes, but at a cost far greater than anticipated, both physical and psychological. And as the sun rose fully over the island, the battlefield lay in a moment of eerie stillness. Silence replaced the chaos, but the weight of the destruction remained palpable. The aftermath was not just a reckoning of bodies, but a reckoning of spirit, of the fragile line between courage and annihilation, and the inescapable reality that war was not measured in glory alone, but in the devastation left behind. The ridge, scarred and littered with the remnants of the charge, would forever hold the memory of that day, a day when innovation, terror, and human determination collided in a single, unforgettable moment. The battlefield had grown quiet, but the silence was heavy with the echoes of terror. The distant crash of waves against the jagged cliffs seemed almost gentle compared to the horror that had swept through the ridge moments before. Japanese survivors huddled in small clusters among the wreckage of their once proud charge, eyes hollow, hands trembling, and hearts pounding with a mix of fear, disbelief, and shame. Sergeant Hiroshi sat against a scorched tree trunk, his rifle abandoned at his side. He traced a bloodied hand over the dirt, over the bodies of men who had fought beside him, over friends now lost forever. His mind replayed the steel balls tumbling down the slope, the mechanical precision of their destruction, and the helplessness he had felt as trained soldiers were thrown into chaos. Courage had counted for nothing. Honor had been meaningless. For the first time, he truly understood the brutal futility of war. We were supposed to advance," a young soldier whispered, voice shaking. His eyes darted across the slope, searching for anyone else alive. "We followed orders, and yet—" His words trailed into silence, swallowed by the horror that had overtaken him. Around him, other survivors avoided eye contact, staring blankly at the ground or into the trees, as though acknowledging the destruction would make it more real. The retreat was quiet, broken only by the occasional stumble or gasp of pain. Soldiers who could walk moved slowly, dragging themselves through the jungle, carrying the memory of the impossible wave of steel that had shattered them in an instant. For many, the psychological wound cut deeper than the physical, and fear now mingled with guilt, shame, and disbelief. Even in survival, they were haunted by the faces of comrades crushed or hurled down the slope, their screams forever etched into memory. Meanwhile, the Americans moved through the battlefield with cautious relief. Private Miller's hands still shook as he lowered his rifle. The ingenuity of their improvised weapon had won the day, yet victory was not a simple triumph. The bodies scattered across the hillside, the horror in the eyes of the survivors, and the sheer, unimaginable destruction weighed on every man who had fired a shot or pulled a lever. The success of the device brought no joy, only an uneasy mixture of awe and guilt. Corporal Jenkins knelt beside one of the surviving Japanese soldiers, checking for signs of life. The man looked up, trembling, eyes wide with terror, and Jenkins felt an unexpected pang of empathy. "It's over," Jenkins whispered softly. "You're alive." The soldier blinked, almost unable to process the words. Survival, he realized, was a concept he had once taken for granted, but now felt like an unbearable gift. The ingenuity of the American defense was undeniable. By turning the simple laws of physics into a weapon of devastating efficiency, they had rewritten the rules of the battlefield. Yet the reality of what they had unleashed was brutal. Human lives reduced to chaos, courage rendered irrelevant, and the psychological scars of both sides now etched deeply. Even the victors were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that in war, innovation could bring survival. But at a cost heavier than most could bear. Hiroshi's thoughts drifted to the Emperor, to honor, to the pride that had driven them forward in the first place. He felt the emptiness where courage should have been rewarded, replaced instead with terror and futility. How could the world reward acts of bravery when the mechanics of war could so easily destroy it? He looked at the horizon, at the gentle waves and the rising sun, and felt a bitter clarity. War was not honorable. It was a relentless machine, impartial, merciless, and devastating in ways no ideology could prepare one for. For the Americans, the morning light revealed the full scope of the destruction. Miller and Jenkins walked the ridge, eyes scanning for signs of movement, hearts heavy with the knowledge of what had just occurred. They spoke little, letting the silence of the battlefield settle over them. Every step reminded them of the fragile boundary between life and death, courage and terror. Even in victory, the weight of responsibility and the human cost of ingenuity pressed down upon them. The Pacific theater was unforgiving, and both sides knew it. For the Japanese, the lesson was clear. Courage and honor were meaningless against an unpredictable enemy and a battlefield that could be turned against them in unimaginable ways. For the Americans, the lesson was equally stark. Survival often depended not just on skill, but on creativity, timing, and the cold application of force. And yet, neither side could escape the emotional consequences of witnessing so much destruction. As the survivors of both armies paused to catch their breath, the ridge became a tableau of exhaustion, reflection, and sorrow. The war continued beyond the horizon, but in this moment, each soldier carried the weight of the encounter in their mind and soul. For some, it would be a lesson in ingenuity and survival. For others, a memory of terror, futility, and loss that would never fade. The battlefield held its silence, broken only by the occasional groan or whispered word. Both sides had endured the storm, but both were changed forever. The ingenuity of war had revealed its most terrifying face, and the psychological wounds left in its wake were as enduring as the scars on the hillside, and as the sun climbed higher, casting a harsh light on the ravaged slope, one truth became undeniable. The memory of that morning, the steel balls, the screams, the chaos would haunt every man who had witnessed it, shaping their understanding of courage, terror, and the brutal reality of war in the Pacific forever. The ridge lay quiet now, the echoes of screams and the roar of the Banzai charge fading into history. Yet the memory of that morning lingered in the minds of all who had survived. In military history, the battle would be remembered not for grand strategy or overwhelming force, but for ingenuity applied in its most terrifying form. The Americans' unconventional defense, a hillside transformed into a cascading avalanche of steel, had rewritten expectations, demonstrating that warfare was as much about creativity and engineering as it was about courage and numbers. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, the lesson was seared into their souls. Honor and bravery, no matter how fierce, could be rendered meaningless by the unpredictable nature of battle. The Banzai charge, a tactic steeped in tradition and ideology, had been obliterated not by greater numbers or superior firepower, but by the mechanical precision of an invention born from necessity. The psychological impact was profound. Men, trained to embrace fear as fuel, now confronted terror in a form they could neither understand nor control. The Americans, too, carried the weight of the day. Victory had come at the cost of witnessing unimaginable human suffering. Private Miller and Corporal Jenkins would never forget the sights of the hillside, the rolling steel, the chaos, the terrified faces of soldiers crushed by forces beyond comprehension. Their ingenuity had saved lives, but it had also inflicted terror, leaving scars that no metal could erase. The ridge itself became a symbol of the duality of war: survival and horror, triumph and moral reckoning, ingenuity and destruction. Historians would later cite the battle as a remarkable example of unconventional tactics in the Pacific theater. It was a stark reminder that ingenuity could shape the outcome of combat in ways both brilliant and horrifying. The psychological lessons were equally enduring. The mind, even in the most disciplined soldier, could be shattered in an instant when confronted with the unexpected. Courage was tested not only against bullets and bombs, but against the unpredictable forces of invention and circumstance. Yet beyond strategy and historical records, the human cost of the encounter lingered. The ridge, scarred and silent, became a graveyard of memories. Each footprint in the dirt, each splintered tree, each scatter of metal bore witness to the fragility of life in war. Survivors carried the lessons home, etched into their minds with clarity that history books could never fully convey. Fear, courage, ingenuity, and death had collided on that slope, leaving behind a narrative that was as much about the human spirit as it was about tactics. And as the sun set over the island, casting long shadows across the ridge, the battlefield seemed almost to breathe in the fading light. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint echoes of what had occurred: cries, metal, panic, and mingling them with the waves that lapped at the cliffs below. The scene was hauntingly beautiful in its silence. Yet every survivor knew that beauty was born from terror. Generations would remember the story not merely as a battle, but as a testament to the unpredictability of war. It was a moment when courage met mechanical ingenuity, when human bravery collided with an unstoppable force, and when survival was determined as much by invention as by valor. The ridge remained, scarred and quiet, a silent monument to the collision of ingenuity, terror, and the human cost of conflict. In the end, the legacy of that day was simple yet chilling. In war, the line between triumph and horror is razor thin, and sometimes 1,000 steel balls rolling down a slope can rewrite history in an instant. The hillside remained silent, but in every shadow, every glint of metal in the rising sun, and every whisper of the wind through the trees, the memory of that morning lingered, an unforgettable reminder that war is as unpredictable as it is brutal, and that terror can strike in the most unexpected of forms.